Okay, well, it's a great pleasure now to welcome Professor Roger Trigg for our next talk. He's in that very happy position of being an emeritus professor, which means he can now spend his time doing the things he really wants to do rather than things in addition that he had to do he didn't really want to. And he's certainly not lacking things to be doing, as you'll see from his CV. So he was Professor of Philosophy at Warwick, and is now Emeritus Professor there, but he's also, again, working in Oxford, like our previous speaker, on a number of things. He's Academic Director of the new Centre for Religion in Public Life in Oxford University, and he's written a couple of books. One is Religion in Public Life, and one is Philosophy Matters. We've got those at the back. And he tells me he's about to write another one on religious freedoms, which we'll certainly look forward to in the contemporary climate when that comes out. He was also founding chairman of the British Philosophical Association and the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion, and was chairman of those, and has a particular interest in the relationship between science and religion from the philosophical perspective. So that's a very valuable perspective, I think, for us today to take on board at the beginning. So we've had a very practical thing about Darwinism, and now we're going to look at some of the underpinning philosophy between science and religion. So over to you, Roger. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here. And I'm afraid I have to go after lunch, so if you want to argue with me over lunch, do, but I won't be on the panel. I'm making a quick getaway. The theme that I was given was rationality in science and religion. I hope you all have the handout in front of you. I'm not using PowerPoint because philosophy is very abstract, and I found from bitter experience that really if I put things up on the screen, it's really going to be things that will be on the handout, and it's nice of you to take that away. If I start illustrating, it gets very artificial. I remember there was one comedy programme on the BBC which was lampooning the various ways in which sometimes the BBC news bulletins illustrate every conceivable thing just to make it right for television. They referred to the Lord Privy Seal, who was a kind of functionary in the government, and they showed a picture of a lord, a picture of a privy, that's a lavatory, and a picture of a seal sitting on a rock by the sea. And I thought, well, illustrating my talk with a PowerPoint is going to be a bit like that. So I hope you, in fact, can follow the handouts. Before I get involved with the handouts, I would just like to talk a little bit about how the issue of rationality, I found, particularly arises in two things I'm working at the moment in Oxford. As was mentioned, I'm interested in the issue of religion in public life. It's a very salient issue at the moment in many countries. And one of the big issues about it is, of course, what is the role of rationality in public life when it comes to religion? How often do we in fact find that people say, oh, that's a matter of faith? And the implication is it's faith, not reason. So reason is one thing, faith is another. And we had an echo of this in the earlier talk this morning when John Brock was talking about people who saw different magisteria, different spheres of influence for religion and for science. Now the great danger of that is you have two things that never meet. But what actually happens, I think, is that science gains a monopoly on fact, and we'll come back to that again. But you find that science talks about facts, religion talks about, well, whatever isn't fact, and perhaps morality, more likely personal preferences, personal tastes. And so very quickly you get to a situation that reason in the public sphere is about things that can be verified and checked, things scientists deal with, and on the other hand, religion, if it's to be tolerated, is something that consenting adults do in private. It isn't something that can be discussed publicly, and indeed it is something that should not be discussed publicly. And this is put forward by many philosophers. I heard Habermas, the famous German philosopher and social theorist, talk not very long ago when he said, and he, though he's coming from more of an atheistic side of things, and with great respect for science, he nevertheless has a respect for the religious heritage of Europe. But he said that when a legislator goes into the legislative chamber, he or she must leave any religious views outside. Religion must not enter into their deliberations. They should not give religious reasons. They should not be religiously motivated. That religion is not something there to be imposed on other people or even discussed with other people. Religion is private. And so the subtitle of my book is Must Faith Be Privatized? And there is a very definite, I think, connection between views of science as establishing rationality in public and religion as being something else, and therefore it's not public, it's private, it's not objective, it's subjective. And presumably it's not talking about truth, because that's what science does. It's talking about something else, what I feel, meaning perhaps, or something, but certainly how I live my life, which may not be how you ought to live your life. It isn't certainly how reality is. And so religion has been pushed to the sidelines and beyond. Now this has enormous repercussions for political life. We find that in fact then it's very easy for people to assume that the correct way to approach things is for a country to be avowedly secular, which means it takes no account of religion. Religion is to be accepted as a private activity. This is, of course, very much the French way. They have a doctrine called laïcité, where, in fact, religion has no public role, which is why, therefore, religious symbols are frowned on in public, and particularly in schools and in public officials, for instance, wouldn't be expected, for instance, to, well, certainly not wear an Islamic headdress or even a cross. So, gradually, any kind of religious commitment is moved out of the public sphere, but more important, reasoning about religion is thought to be inappropriate. Now this, as I said, is because rationality is thought to be the province of science. It's thought to be the province of the accessible world, and the accessible world is just the world as experienced through science. It is nothing to do with the world as seen by religion. I regard this as exceptionally dangerous because, of course, it does remove reason from religion, any religion, totally. Now, that has various effects. It can mean that, of course, you think that religion is irrational and therefore should be fought against, and there's more than a whiff of that in some of the work of people like Richard Dawkins, who no doubt will be mentioned several times this week. But there's quite an aggressive idea that religion is not true and therefore must not be allowed to spread, must not be taught. And that's more than just saying it's a private matter. It's saying actually even teaching a child religion is, in his words, child abuse. I think he's gone to a summer camp to teach children atheism. Apparently that's all right. And, but presumably, and you can see that's perfectly logical if he thinks atheism is true and all religion is false. But nevertheless, other views about rationality may be a little bit more guarded, and they may want to say, well, we're not going to come to any conclusion about religion, it's just nevertheless something to be kept in private. Public reason is something that's reason accessible to everybody. It's secular reason. It isn't anything that of itself will give a religious disagreement. Now, as I've said, I regard that as dangerous, not just because it takes away any right of any religion to claim truth. It takes away any idea that religion matters, really. It's just something that people might find helpful in their private lives. It's not about anything that's true. But there is another aspect. I've been talking about religion. Now, I think there's a very big question about what is religion. You'll find that it's always going to be very difficult to define religion. Lawyers hate having to define it. They always refuse to. In fact, in Europe now, they hedge their bets by talking about religion and belief. And, but even then, there's the question of what kind of beliefs, not every belief. So they haven't really solved the problem. But it's a kind of catch-all. They don't really want to commit themselves to saying what religion is. But if then you believe that religion somehow has to be tolerated, and in a democratic society, it's very difficult to take the Dawkins line and say, actually we will, and even he wouldn't go as far as to say, to do this, and say we will actually stamp it out. You've got to accept that people are free to believe these strange things. But if you can't reason with them, any religious belief is as good as any other. All religions are going to be exactly the same. Now, this is more or less the legal position in the United States, where, in fact, there is, I think, more protection for religion than in Europe. But it's not just Christianity. It's, in fact, all religion. The free exercise of religion is protected. So all you've got to do is to, in fact, make clear that your free exercise of religion is being impeded, and obviously there may be a substantial burden on you. Unless the government has a conclusive reason for actually having to do that, and the onus is on them for proving it, you're going to be able to exercise your religion. Doesn't matter what it is. And I find that worrying. There was a case, I find this almost unbelievable, but it is true. In the Midwest in the 1970s, there were a group of prisoners who claimed that they belonged to a religion that demanded that even though they were in prison, they were served with sherry and steak every Friday night at 5 o'clock. And this went through the courts, and they got away with it. They were called the Church of the New Song. As one sociologist who'd studied the case pointed out to me, he didn't think it was a coincidence that the acronym for that was CONS. I think that they knew what they were doing. They weren't too worried that people realised what they were doing, but they still were able to argue their case through the courts and got away with it. Now, I do really think that, and I mean that perhaps might be laughable, but there are other cases of more dangerous religions. Not all religion is good. Some is bad. The present Pope has talked about the fact there is a pathology of religion, and I think that sums up. Some things are warped. We ought to be able to discuss that publicly. If you push religion to the sidelines, these things can't be confronted in public. You either, therefore, just respect religion, or religion as far as you can, and ignore it, or, in fact, I think you have to allow it into the public sphere on the assumption that people can both argue for and against it. And I think that's much healthier. Religion must be willing to face rational criticism, as well as, in fact, try and make its case. Because if religious people believe that what they hold is true, they ought to be able to stand up for their beliefs and in the public sphere. A democracy is no democracy if we all agree. I mean, we don't really need democracy if everybody naturally agrees. Democracy is a way of dealing with disagreement, and to take some of the most important disagreements out of the democratic debate and say you can't do it because there are religious reasons. And there are philosophers in America who would argue this, starting, I suppose, from John Rawls, but more specifically recently, philosophers like Robert Audi have said that you mustn't, in fact, use religious reasons in public debate. You mustn't even be motivated in your public actions by religious motivations. It's all right if they're there as long as you have secular ones as well. I don't think that's right. I think it's much better if it's all out in the open. Now, the reason I'm going on about this is that it's because there's been an assumption that religious reasons are not public reasons. Reasons for faith are different from reasons in science. Indeed, reasons for faith, it's almost a contradiction in terms. Faith is just faith. Now, I've never thought that, because faith is always faith in something. Once you specify it, you have to start arguing and clarifying about what it is you have faith in. You're already in the sphere of human reason. So I think that it's absolutely wrong, therefore, to think that religion can be put in a compartment separate from other compartments. It should be out there in the world, facing reason as much as any other, as much as science. Now, if I can just briefly talk about something else I'm involved with in Oxford. I'm involved with a project. We got nearly £2 million from Templeton for it, so it must be important. And that's what the press thought anyway. We got an editorial in the London Times even about it. It shows how people think that money is what or anything that matters. But anyway, I'm involved in this project on the cognitive science of religion. Now this is a project, an empirical project, for both psychologists and anthropologists on the one hand, and philosophers of religion particularly, and theologians on the other. The philosophers looking at the implications of the empirical discoveries. The other side of the project is trying, in an area where there is not a lot of empirical hard fact at the moment, is trying to further empirical work. Now, what is the cognitive science of religion? I think it is very relevant to issues about the whole aspect of rationality in religion, and I've come up against various issues. So I just want to sketch very quickly what some of the issues that are raised here before I go on to the broader issues about rationality. Because what the cognitive science of religion is claiming is that religion is actually natural. In other words, it's the default option. Now again, there's the issue about what is religion, but certain impulses that we have are, it might be called, the default option. Now this goes against a lot of what we're taught by modern atheism, that in a sense, really children are little atheists until their minds are warped. What the cognitive science of religion is looking at is the theory that actually children particularly, but also the same thing applies if you look across the world at anthropology, children particularly, in fact, start by finding it very easy to think in ways that are congenial to religion. In fact, it's easier to think in ways that lead to religion. I don't mean everybody suddenly is born with an idea of God, but they certainly are born with ideas that can easily lead to beliefs in gods or gods. There's some evidence to think that, for instance, we are natural dualists. We, in other words, look at each other and recognize gradually that we each have minds. Now, the contemporary received opinion in even theology and philosophy very often is anti-dualist. I'm suspicious of that myself, but there's a lot more to be said for the separation of mind and body than is sometimes allowed. But I won't go into that so much today, but just to say that anyway, it's easier for us to think that I am not my body, that you are not just your body. It's easier, and you see this particularly in anthropology, for people to, in fact, think that when people die, they go on surviving, that there is a life after death. If I could just, as a philosopher, I don't do many experiments. There is just one experiment I did with my grandchildren. Now this is, you can say, oh yeah, this is just with 2 children, but this is written up in quite a lot of psychological literature, so I was just replicating results. I've got twin grandchildren, a boy and a girl. They're just aged 5. Last year, when they were 3 3/4, I did this, and then I did it again this year. It's a very simple thing. If you, in fact, have, say, a couple of cups and an apple, and you put the apple under one of the cups, and Mummy's there, and Mummy sees what you've done, and then Mummy goes out of the room, and then you change the apple from under one cup to under the other. And then, in fact, you ask the child, when Mummy comes back in, where do you think she'll think the apple is? A child of up to about 4 will say, and both independently of my grandchildren said it, oh, Mummy will say it's in that cup, the new one, because the assumption is Mummy knows everything. If it's there, she'll know it's there. But in fact, it's just that reality is something that she understands. So the fact you changed it, the fact she wasn't there when you changed it doesn't matter. Now this year when I did this at Easter, a year on, I did it with them separately, and just as a little game, Mummy went out, and I changed it, and I said, now when they come in, where will Mummy think it is? And they both were quite sure that Mummy would still think it was where she'd seen it put. she wouldn't think that it had been changed from one to the other. Now, the point being that they've developed a theory of mind, as the technical position goes, that they understand that people see things from perspective. They no longer think, using a theological term, that Mummy's omniscient. But the next question is, what about God? What would they say about God? And I asked each of my grandchildren about God. Now, I mean, you might say, well, that they're being brought up in a religious household, so this might more be. But never mind. I asked them, what would God see? Where would he think it is? And they both independently agreed that God would know where the apple had gone. And my little granddaughter said, when I asked why, God sees everything. My little grandson looked at me in a puzzled way and said, but God's God. And I think that, therefore, what this is showing, and I mean, it's just a little experiment, that it's quite easy to think in terms of omniscience. That instead of us starting with just the world of chairs and tables around us and then wondering if we can go beyond, in a way we start with the idea that everybody knows everything, and gradually we realise that's not true. But we still think that about God. Now, you can do this with other things. I mean, I think that, I said that there's a kind of folk dualism. We believe that other people have other minds. I think that there's also some research being done in this kind of area, actually, which suggests that children particularly see purpose in the world around. What are rocks for? Why are they pointed? They think that somebody's done it, somebody's made it. In other words, creationism is, in a sense, the default option. This is what we naturally think. We look around and look for purpose in things and see it. It's much more difficult not to see purpose. And I think that, of course, there's a lot more research to be done in this, but it does suggest that our starting point is much more open to ideas of spirits, God, than perhaps sometimes people have thought. Now, all that shows is that that's our natural reaction, that's our starting point. It doesn't show anything about whether it's true, it doesn't show anything about whether it's reasonable to go on thinking like that. But that's, in a sense, part of my point, that we start with these natural reactions. I mean, people just, common sense views are of people with other minds, of purpose in the world, and so on. Perhaps we have to grow out of that. It may very well be the case. But another thing that people in the cognitive science religion have tended to point out is that in some ways, although religion is understood as these very basic religious impulses, are natural, theology is very far from natural, because it involves deep reflection on these and building up theological systems which are very far from obvious. And so vaguely thinking that God sees everything is very different from enunciating the doctrine of the Trinity, for instance. But science is on the level of theology. Science itself is unnatural. It isn't the way we ordinarily think. So science is a second-order reflection, just as theology is, on basic experiences of the world. Now, of course, science involves rationality, but I would also want to say so does theology as well. But one of the things about the cognitive science of religion that I've come across is, and this is getting now much more back to the whole issue of rationality, is that a lot of people in this area start off by being what they call themselves methodological naturalists. It's a term that we heard John use earlier this morning. And of course, if you're a scientist, it is very, very important that you know that you're looking for natural causes, that as a good scientist, the answer that why did that happen? Oh, because the fairies at the bottom of the garden did it, is not a good scientific answer. So, and in the same way, the answer God did it is stopping the argument far too quickly. So, as a matter of methodology, in the advance of science, naturalism, in a sense putting blinkers on and looking at the natural world and shutting out any notion of transcendental, supernatural influences, has been important. But it's surprising how very quickly people switch without knowing that they're doing it from what I would term methodological naturalism to metaphysical naturalism. I was reading a paper a couple of days ago on the cognitive science of religion by somebody in Aarhus University, one of the centres of study of this, and he said that he was arguing from the standpoint of methodological naturalism. In the next paragraph, he started talking about religious fictions, and he meant it. I mean, his methodological naturalism involved the assumption that anything that was not treatable by science was not just to be put on one side, bracketed out, perfectly legitimate thing to do, it was actually false. And this is a thing that I found in the whole area of the cognitive science of religion, that even to allow the possibility of talk about God or the supernatural, even for theologians to enter into the discussion about the relevance of this, is anathema to many scientists working in the field. That they're hardline naturalists, they want to explain religion in the sense of giving scientific explanations for religious impulses, which actually explain religion away. They're not just showing some of the background assumptions which make it easy to believe in religion or make it difficult. They don't understand why, and it's a very important thing, why sometimes as humans we find certain things easy, other things difficult to believe. Like, why is it, because of our evolutionary history, we like certain foods and don't like others? Why do we like sweet things? I mean, it's reasonable to look at all of that, and no doubt our evolutionary history can tell us something about why we find some things more congenial. But to say that is going to tell us the whole story is to stand outside science and to make a philosophical assumption. Now, I started off by talking about the fact that philosophy is rather abstract and it doesn't lend itself to PowerPoint. Of course, this is one of the problems when you're dealing with tough-minded scientists. They get irritated by philosophy, they get irritated by philosophers too. But if one starts saying that actually you're making philosophical assumptions, they look at you as if you're just being deliberately difficult. We're dealing with facts, and they just, but by bracketing out certain things, they're making very, very big assumptions. There is a very great tendency in a lot of modern debate to be given false alternatives. So if it's not this, it's that. I mean, an obvious one is evolution or intelligent design or creationism. I mean, it's, if you don't sign up to a kind of evolutionary naturalism with a lot else written in, therefore they're going to be supporting intelligent design. And there are lots of choices like that that are always going to be false choices, I think. And I think the thing is not to be bludgeoned because you're against something to actually go for what's being put forward as the alternative, because it may not be the only alternative. So in the cognitive science of religion, it's a good test case really of how naturalism becomes quite a metaphysical weapon, and that it's regarded as being unscientific to even be willing to talk to philosophers and theologians, let alone entertain the possibility of there being anything beyond science, that perhaps science can't explain everything. Now, as I've said, it's a very important part of science to try and see how far you can get. But the metaphysical position is that standing outside science, you say, actually, reality is only what science says it is. I mean, that itself creates a difficulty, because is it what science says it is now? Or science as it one day will be? Or science as it one day might be? This matters. Now, I was brought up in, I suppose, the last few years, in a sense, the heyday of logical positivism, with A.J. Ayer in Oxford. He wrote a very famous book called Language, Truth and Logic, which in fact put forward a hardline view that meaning is just the way you verify or falsify. It's very science-based, so what can't be verified scientifically is meaningless. So if I say God exists, it's just a meaningless string of words. It's just, it says nothing more than that. It's just nothing. Because it doesn't latch on to anything, it doesn't say anything. Now, I remember, and this dates me, but I remember when actually for Ayer and people who agreed with him, there was an issue about the status of the other side of the moon. Now, this month we're celebrating 40 years since the man landed on the moon. But before satellites went round the moon, nobody had actually observed it. Now, the fact that we hadn't observed it meant that you couldn't say that it had actually been verified. Now, in principle, you know what it would be to observe it. But then the question is, how far do you press that notion of in principle? Can we, in principle, verify the other side of the universe? Now, I think that, to cut a long story short, this kind of logical positivism, pinning reality to science, in fact doesn't work for physics. There are lots of unobservable entities, the material of a black hole, not let alone all the issues about quantum mechanics. So there are lots of things in physics that don't make sense with a very kind of rough and ready verificationism and falsificationism. People know nowadays that theories matter, that there are theoretical entities that play an important role. So I think logical positivism doesn't work for science. Well, why am I talking about this? It isn't just my intellectual history. Logical positivism is not alive and well for the most part in philosophy departments, but it is certainly alive and well in the hearts and minds of people like Richard Dawkins, who in fact define rationality, define evidence in terms of what science can find out. Now, this was brought home to me very much at a meeting I was at in Cambridge just over a week ago of the International Society for Science and Religion. And there one of the speakers was a very famous biologist known for championing group selection named David Sloan Wilson. And he wanted to talk about religious fictions, etc. He just assumed that anything that religion is dealing with is false, that in fact fact is settled by science. From my point of view, pure logical positivism. And when I challenged him on this, his reaction was very interesting, because he assumed that if I was not a naturalist, in other words, just putting forward the view that science defines reality, the natural world is the world as investigated by science, therefore I must be a postmodernist. Now, this again is a good illustration of how, you have either A or B. If you're not A, you must be B. Now, two of the things that I have written about a lot, for instance in Philosophy Matters, the iniquities of naturalism and the iniquities of postmodernism. And why? Because actually I think both of them undermine the proper role for human reason. Now, naturalism, as David Sloan Wilson was putting forward, he was just defining it in his terms. I mean, that he wasn't arguing for it. He was just, in a sense, winning the argument by defining his terms. I'm willing to accept that naturalism could be the end of a long philosophical debate. I mean, it's an important one of the most important ones, about what is the nature of reality. And naturalism is, in a sense, the updated version of materialism, but it's very difficult to define matter nowadays, so people who tend to be a bit more circumspect. So naturalism is a philosophical position worthy of respect, but worthy of a great deal of philosophical argument. But there's no doubt about it, it does raise issues about the role of human reason and how far we can justify rationally because naturalism is switching all talk from reason to causes. So in other words, I'm never going to be believing something because I believe it to be true. I'm believing it because I'm caused to believe it's true. In other words, there's no real difference between reasoning and rationalizing. And I mean, a good example of rationalization is post-hypnotic suggestion. You put someone under hypnosis and say, when you come out of hypnosis, you will pick up an umbrella and open it. Somebody comes out of hypnosis, they do that. And you say, why on earth do you do that? They don't say, I don't know, or they don't even realize that it's a post-hypnotic suggestion. They'll think up a reason. They'll think, oh, well, I suddenly thought that I better check that it was still working right before I go outside. Or, that's a rationalization. The cause isn't the reason. Now, in a sense, I would argue that all naturalism is doing that. That it's saying that all our human reasoning is, in fact, to be explained causally, presumably ultimately through neuroscience, through what's happening in our brain. In other words, to use a bit of jargon, I mean all causation is bottom-up in the brain rather than top-down. And some people would think, with the motoring properties and so on, it could be top-down. But if you think of it as bottom-up, then everything that we do, everything we think, is caused, and we don't have to be aware of the causes. Indeed, ultimately we won't be, because we're not all aware of all of the brain processes and the neural signaling that's going on. So ultimately, reason is subtracted by naturalism from the process. Now, I said naturalism is a philosophical theory. I think that it's an important one. Because it's a philosophical theory, it's an archetypal theory of reasoning. It's reasoning to conclusions. If people are naturalists and accept naturalists, they have to accept that their belief in naturalism is itself caused for all kinds of reasons of which they may not be aware. It could be. They don't believe it because it's true. It could be true, but if it is true, that's accidental. There's no connection between their belief and truth. Truth is no longer the target. And so, in the end, therefore, naturalism itself, I would argue, undermines itself. Because if it's true, you can't believe that it is true with good reason. So, I'm very suspicious of naturalism. I think it overreaches itself. On the other side, what about postmodernism? And you see, it's so easy for scientists to think that because you reject their narrow view of science as the source of reason, you're rejecting science as any source of reason. Now, I would say that science is one of the most wonderful expressions of human rationality. There's no doubt about that. That science is an important outworking of the way we react rationally to the world. And it deals with raw material like our own natural impulses, like the impulses of children. It reflects on them, and it reflects on them rationally. And in fact, I think that we need rationality to do science. Otherwise, science itself will fall to the ground. So the alternative is not postmodernism. Now, postmodernism, in fact, undermines the whole idea of rationality by making it relative to tradition or epoch or whatever. I mean, one of the problems about postmodernism is what are the things relative to? But it's a very good example of a modern relativist thesis. It's reacting against the modern view of reason and truth, and because the modern view of reason and truth became narrowed down very much to science, it seems to be reacting against science. For that reason, I think some theologians have rather welcomed postmodernism, because they think that, that therefore my enemy's enemy must be my friend. But it may not be. And I think the fact that postmodernism takes science down several pegs is not a good sign for theology, because it attacks science by undermining its claim to truth, because it says there's no such thing as objective truth. That's the death of all religion. If there's no such thing as truth, it can't claim truth. So postmodernism as well rejects any notion of rationality, any notion of reason. It says that reasoning, what counts as a good reason, depends on your tradition, depends on what kind of perspective you're operating from. So, from that point of view, relativism, as exemplified by postmodernism, is something that itself is very, very corrosive of all human understanding. Now, how do we put all of this together? How, in fact, do we, in fact, say that science and religion must be, in fact, combined, as I do think that they should? I don't think that science should have a monopoly on rationality. I don't think that science and religion should be put in different compartments. I think that they should meet on common ground, and that common ground is objective reality. I'm not going to define in advance reality in a way that says that only science with its empirical methods has access to it. I mean, there's a question as well as to what one means by empirical methods, because they themselves can change over the years. Quine, very famous philosopher, said one very interesting thing once, that he thought that the day might come when science could, in fact, cope with ghosts and explain ghosts. Now, that's a much more interesting, I think, approach than the many philosophers who would say they don't believe in ghosts and they can't exist, and therefore they won't believe any so-called evidence for ghosts because they're not going to believe in ghosts. It's leaving it open that there could be phenomena of a peculiar kind that, in fact, modern science can't cope with, but science might one day do cope with it. Now, I'm going much further than that, of course, because I would want to say that there may be elements of reality, levels of reality that perhaps science can't cope with. I still remember, actually, one of the times when I sort of shudder at thinking of it, really, because I realised how I was entering into something that I didn't quite realise I was entering into. When I was a rather naive undergraduate and went to a seminar conducted by A.J. Ayer, I said, because I thought I ought to say something on point, I said, aren't there levels of reality? And he really jumped down my throat, because, of course, that was absolute anathema to him, that I'd been brought up in a kind of classical education and with Plato and so on. Well, I still think there are levels of reality, but, of course, he didn't, because he thinks there's one level of reality, namely that accessible to science. Now, one of the most important things about science is that it doesn't occur in a vacuum. I've been talking about science defining facts, naturalists saying that science it determines what is real. But what they never do is stand back from science, and this is the kind of philosophical question that can irritate some scientists, and say, what has to be the case, what does the world have to be like for science to be possible in the first place? In other words, rather than just defining rationality in terms of science, one stands back and thinks, what has to be the case for science to be a rational enterprise? Why is it we think that science is a rational enterprise? I'm afraid I think that science needs a grounding. It needs a justification. Wittgenstein talked of language games. He's another of those people who tended to divide things up into compartments. So there might be a religious language game, a scientific language game. He had great difficulties in his book on Certainty in trying to explain why somebody should believe in physics rather than oracles. Well, they're just different systems of belief. I mean, there you can almost see the seeds of postmodernism. But what he couldn't say is, well, physics is talking about what's true. But why is it, A, that the world is such that science can make sense of it, and B, that humans are such that we, in fact, or some of us, can be scientists? So science, I think, needs a philosophical justification. It should not be just taken for granted. We cannot, with Wittgenstein, just say, this language game is played. I like cricket, usually anyway, and when England are doing rather better than they are at the moment. But I would not want to give a metaphysical justification for cricket, and I wouldn't want to say that cricket is true in some kind of sense. It's a game. You don't have to justify it beyond its own terms. In a way, you see, that's what people like Wittgenstein are saying science is, or other human activities. But that isn't good enough. Science is much more important and serious than that. So is religion. They can only be justified in terms of what they're trying to find out. It needs a grounding and a justification. Now, I've already talked about postmodernism and how it reacted against modernity and modernity's idea of reason, truth. Now, that's really the view of late modernity in the 18th century. But I think it's worth just mentioning that if you go back a little bit to the 17th century, at the start of the Enlightenment, particularly in England, there was a much wider view of human reason and a much broader view of the basis of science. Science in France in the late 18th century became avowedly materialistic. And, of course, religion was deliberately discarded. Churches were, in fact, turned into temples of reason. But that was very, very definitely not the case in, for instance, Cambridge in the 17th century, at the time of Newton. We've already heard reference to Newton this morning and his religious beliefs. He had a theological grounding for his science. He thought the world was such that it could be understood because it was made by a God who made it regular, orderly, and also comprehensible, because humans are made in the image of God. We share something of God's ability to understand the world. Now, that was a view in the 17th century. Some of my favourite philosophers and theologians were the Cambridge Platonists, who were here in the 17th century. I mean, as the name suggests, they were mainly in Cambridge around about the time of the English Civil War. Several of them were the original founders, amongst the original founders of the Royal Society. And one of their slogans, and you can see it in the glass of Emmanuel College Chapel behind Benjamin Whichcote, who's Provost of Kings as well, was that reason is the candle of the Lord, quotation from Proverbs, but reason is the candle of the Lord. And I think that that's a very interesting remark, because it goes very much against modern ideas in the New Atheist Creed that rationality, evidence, knowledge are all science-based and science undermines religion. For them, religion was the starting point because it gave them the ability to trust in human reason and to trust that the world we live in was such that human reason could gain a grip on it. And so the early Enlightenment was, I think, so far from anti-religious, it was built out of religion, so far from, in fact, championing science as the enemy of religion, it gave a religious basis for science. Now, historically, I think that's true. I would argue philosophically that I think science still needs some kind of justification. You can see in the empiricism of the British empiricist philosophers, the drift from Locke, if they go Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Locke was a 17th century philosopher who, although very science-based, and although many people think he was somebody who respected science, he was a very much a committed Christian, in 17th century terms a latitudinarian, no doubt, follower of the Cambridge Platonists, so much so he nearly married the daughter of one of them, so he knew all about their thought. He uses that phrase, reason is the candle of the Lord, sometimes in his work. So for Locke, who of course isn't just a famous philosopher as far as science is concerned, but very much one of the great influences on the founding of the United States, Jefferson thought that he was one of the three greatest men who'd ever lived, and he had a picture of him in his home in Monticello. But so even 100 years later, Locke's influence was living on politically, as it had lived on in the glorious revolution 1688 in this country. But you start with Locke, who was therefore a very much a religious philosopher. I mean, I say that advisedly, though people don't normally think of him like that. He wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. And Then you get, through Berkeley, to Hume, who avowedly knocks away any religious foundations. And then there's the very real question, how you can justify induction, how you can look at the world and go from here to there, from now to then. How can we justify from our present experience to something beyond? How can we generalize? And science, I think, gets into trouble from that point on. That, in a sense, it can't justify itself. And one of the answers, philosophically and scientifically, that many people might make is, oh, we don't need a justification, science works, so we don't need to bother. I mean, it produces the goods, we've got our non-stick frying pan, so why worry? But me as a philosopher, I don't think that's good enough. I would want some kind of philosophical justification. So, to just sum up, I would oppose naturalism. I think that it undermines reason. I oppose relativism and the relativism of postmodernism. That certainly undermines reason. The conduct of science, the practice of religion, both have to assume there's a truth to be discovered, not constructed, and we need reason to discover that truth. And we have to distinguish in each between the world and our understanding of it. We have to be willing to revise our scientific beliefs. We have to be willing to look at all religious beliefs critically. That doesn't mean we give them up, but it does mean that if we want to keep them, we have to be able to defend them rationally. I came across a story, I think it's true, of a woman who said she didn't want to go to an exhibition about Darwin because she was afraid it would undermine her faith. Now, you see, that kind of attitude, I think, is just not good enough. You can't just wrap your faith in a kind of cotton wool cocoon. You have to be able to confront issues and to answer them, not be afraid of meeting them in the first place. Both science and religion claim truth about the same objective world. Both must resist relativism, but each must not shut it themselves off from each other. Human reason is expressed in both, and I would go so far as to say both can learn from each other. But that, I suppose, is another story.
Thank you very much, Roger. Right, that's questions for you. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Roger, for your speech. And
finding a middle way between relativism and logical positivism. No? I find very interesting this paper of Einstein, Podolsky, Rosen of 1985 about quantum mechanics. Because in that paper they assume the philosophical principle, the principle of reality. Now, as you know, logical positivists mean that anything that is not testable is meaningless. Now the point is that philosophical principle cannot be tested as such, and obviously also the principle of reality cannot be tested as such. But in conjunction with physical assumptions or scientific assumption, it can be tested. It indeed has been. I mean, the history of quantum mechanics of the last 60 years is about exactly the test of this issue. So I think that it would be very interesting to have a sort of interface between metaphysics or other fields of philosophy and science that is a set of philosophical assumptions that have empirical content. Philosophical assumptions that cannot be tested as such, but can be in conjunction with scientific assumptions. I think this is a very interesting point. It is how to find an interface. I don't know whether you agree or not.
Yes, no, I think that's very interesting. Of course, quantum mechanics is a prime example of where, in fact, the interpretation of quantum mechanics is very heavily influenced by philosophical views.
Yeah.
And I mean, the thing about philosophy, of course, is that I suppose almost by definition it can't be empirically tested, but it has a bearing on our experience of the world because, I mean, for one thing, philosophical views, I think, may show why it is that we are able to think certain things, or what that the presuppositions that are implicit in our thoughts and language, our understanding, can be made explicit. I mean, what worries me so often about some philosophical views is that they undermine the very assumptions behind the way we in fact actually argue. Relativism obviously does, I think. Sometimes in a very obvious and incoherent way. I mean, relativists can sometimes get themselves caught into saying, well, it's true that there's no such thing as truth. And you'll find that, I mean, that's obvious contradiction, but the mere fact that asserting something involves asserting something as true means that it's very difficult to undermine the notion of truth and still go on using language. So there are presuppositions here as well. But obviously, I mean, one very interesting thing is, I suppose, how far particular philosophical views impinge on the way one regards particular scientific positions. And I mean, I'm not sure with quantum mechanics how far, for instance, you could disprove realism from it, actually, or something like that. I think that that's at a different level.
I think that quantum mechanics has contributed to change the view about realism. That is, we are not authorized to assume a strict local and classical realism. That is, we must think about more rational forms. But my point is, do you know how to anchor philosophical and theological issues to science and reality? This is my point.
Oh,
you cannot do this directly. This is my point. Not directly, in general.
No, I think
in general. But you can find indirect means to that. This is one of the possible ways.
And of course, quantum mechanics has had a tremendous influence on the way in which we do look at the world, because it poses questions about the nature of determinism and whether, in fact, at the deepest level, there is a determinism.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, so no longer can we look at the world as a mechanism like a clock, because obviously it's much more complicated than that. And that has a tremendous effect on quite basic philosophical views, doesn't it? And I suppose that just underlines what you're saying. Yes, good, thank you. Yes.
I'd like to plunge even more concertedly into the issue of religion in particular.
Yeah.
You said that postmodernism is extremely is corrosive. And religion's a big canopy. Of course, it encompasses Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, numerous other faiths. And within them, it could be said that there are contradictory claims, fundamentally contradictory claims. So, just sort of following through now with your saying that it's not correct to assume that religion cannot make claims about truth. What would you then say about, in this pluralistic age, about the simultaneous veracity, or verity I should say, of, for example, the claims of Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam with respect to, say, issues like salvation? Would you say then logically they all cannot be correct from a position of truth?
Of course, that's exactly what I'd say. They can't all be true. And I think sometimes in this kind of area, people, I think, mix up questions of truth with questions about how you should respect other people. I mean, just because I respect somebody and the way they hold beliefs doesn't mean I have to respect their beliefs in the strong sense of saying they're as true as what I think. And I think that it's terribly important to respect other people and their right to hold beliefs and to take their beliefs seriously and to learn from them. I mean, the same thing applies in science, because you get a conflict of views in science. You get alternative scientific theories. Science progresses through different theories being tested, and people have got to be willing to allow their own theories to be tested, to look at other people's theories, and to be willing to learn from them. But I think that actually science also advances through people being willing to bet on the truth of what they themselves believe. And as Thomas Kuhn, a historian of science, pointed out, I think sometimes a certain commitment to science and a particular theory in the face of even apparent counterexamples might be more better than, I mean, in other words, you shouldn't give up at the first counterexample, because it's probably better to have a deficient theory with some counterexamples than no theory at all. So sometimes you've got to keep going, even in the face of that. And I think in religion, we each have to recognize that we each believe that what we think is true. So I must accept that what the Muslim thinks is true. But the thing is, although we can respect each other's beliefs, they are not all true. And I think the easy way out in modern society is to think that tolerance implies you shouldn't make adverse judgments about truth. And that there's something to be said for diversity. I myself don't believe that diversity is a good thing in itself. It isn't. It's a means to an end. In science, diversity in different theories is very good in the sense that if you have alternative theories, they can be tested. But that's not where we want to end up, because we want to end up not with alternative theories about phlogiston and oxygen or something, and oh, let 1,000 flowers bloom, isn't it wonderful, we all think something different. We want to get to what's true, and we want to see how things actually are. And this is a way of winning out the false from the true. And I think in religion, I would hope that even though it's difficult, I would hope that we can, and indeed a lot of religions will overlap in some ways, but in some things there's no way in which you can say that we both believe in the Trinity and we don't, and so you can't accept Islam and Christianity. But everybody in one level knows that, but that doesn't mean we have to kill each other or to fail to talk to each other and fail to respect each other. But as I said, there's this great myth nowadays that tolerance somehow means you mustn't criticise rationally, and I think that's dangerous.
There's another question here.
Yeah, a similar one to that, if I may, and thank you very much. First on positivism, I sometimes feel as a scientist, we tend to get misrepresented. I mean, philosophers talk a lot about scientists, and we don't tend to defend ourselves. I think first you have to remember the whole, and I'm just sure you know, but just to remind you all, it's the whole business of specialisation. Because it is so very, very specialised, most day-to-day ordinary scientists like me basically gather evidence, and we try to make sense of that evidence. Now, of course, that has to be done within the context of a certain model, which has evolved over hundreds of years, etc. But it is a bit like a detective. You know, it's a very, very, humble job, if you like. But the key thing is, most scientists, and unfortunately not all, are well aware of that, and they're very careful not to start making sweeping statements about philosophy or theology based on their discoveries. They're well aware that they see most of us choose a profession which is mainly concerned with the how, of how the details work together. And we don't seek to sort of start making all sorts of statements based on that. And the second point I wanted to make about that is, I think what is nice about something that's as confined as that is the whole role of evidence. I mean, it is true, just as Stephen was pointing out, and you mentioned, there are so many different religions, but as far as I can see, they haven't budged. There is no convergence, much that I can see in several thousand years. Whereas the reason science, there is one science, there isn't Jewish science over here and American science over here and Australian science over there, is, as you pointed out, that basically the best theory that fits, or the theory that seems to fit the fact best, tends to win, and it tends to converge in that way. So we end up with one science. So I think most scientists would claim that as a method that's very successful. What they would never claim is that we would be able to explain music, for example. And I would have thought my statement of the lovely ghost analogy you gave would be, I wouldn't think it exciting at all if science could explain ghosts. In fact, I'd be very disappointed. I think it's much more important that most scientists are happy to admit that we may never be able to explain ghosts. It's just the way there's lots of things we don't expect to be explained. It's only one or two, I think, quite rare scientists who are very vocal, who sort of have started this whole scientism thing, that it's a philosophy in its own right, and that it will render all of philosophy and all of religion unnecessary. I don't think that's a common belief among scientists.
Well, perhaps you're lucky in the scientists you meet. I wish they had more of the humble approach you have. But I think that I've come across a lot of people who actually are quite aggressive about this. As I was saying, in the cognitive science of religion, I find that because perhaps it's a new area on the frontiers of where people, I'm afraid theory outstrips fact far too much there. But there's a lot of argument there about who can take part in the discussion and what is the basis for the discussion. And I think that naturalism in some areas, as a stick to beat your opponent with, is all too prevalent. It does vary. I accept, and a lot of just working scientists get on with the job, which is more or less what you were saying.
Yeah.
But I think that, particularly in new sciences, I think that and at the cutting edge of science, in a lot of areas, science and philosophy do tend to overlap. Quantum mechanics is one of them. Research into the brain and the mind would be another. Where again, because perhaps empirical evidence is still a bit short, you're guided very much by assumptions about what you can and can't find out and what your aims are. And some people are a bit too ambitious in it, I think. But nevertheless, I mean, you will have to accept that even though perhaps most scientists are sober and rational, as you say, there are plenty who are making the wild claims, and they're making the money and getting the publicity. So there's no doubt that in the air too.
Can I just say on quantum,
Yeah.
because that's my area?
Yeah.
I mean, from the 40s onwards, as I'm sure you know, it was precisely for that reason. Aaron would agree with me that most people just dropped the philosophy because we could see there was a limit to how far we were coming, to how much we could know. And they simply moved into using it into this sort of semiconductor technology revolution. And very, very few physicists got into the whole area of philosophy of quantum. In fact, they left that to the philosophers, and it created problems because then philosophers had to learn physics, But that's the typical science. And I'm not saying it was a positive thing. It's our limitation that we tend to say, well, we don't really have any evidence beyond this. Therefore, we'll start using it, or we'll move on to something where we can have evidence, rather than sort of go down the whole speculative path where there's no way you can decide one way or the other which is the correct interpretation.
But there is still a space for, in a sense, the mingling of science and philosophy, and in that kind of area. I mean, I think Einstein was getting involved in philosophical ideas. I remember having quite long talks with one of his people called John Archibald Wheeler, who was he thought up the term black hole. He used to be at Princeton. I mean, he was something of an idealist because of, in a philosophical sense, because of quantum mechanics, but there was the whole issue about realism. But I mean, he was a kind of, obviously, a very, very notable scientist, but very interested, because he was working on the cutting edge of the field. He was interested in these philosophical issues very much. So I think it does come in at some points.
My views are close to yours on the main issues that you developed, in particular the questions of naturalism and the question of reason in religion. But I am a little bit more cautious, and I want to sort of play the devil's advocate with you and push some arguments and ask you to respond. One, on naturalism, scientists, and I'm also a scientist, tend to say, I'm a believer and so forth, tend to say naturalism is true, or appears to be true because it works, not in the sense that, okay, let's get on with it, it gives us, air conditioning and so forth, so it's nice and let's not think too much. In the sense that the more we've applied it to different fields, the more we've found it to be successful, and the more we have erased areas or opened up areas that we thought would be very difficult for science to address. And in fact, with very recent progress in science, including on the emergence of life from inert matter, consciousness, intelligence, etc., seem to be opening up now, as we thought would be near walls. And so naturalism is like, for me, why do we think that tomorrow the sun will rise? Because it has done so for a long time, and because our theories seem to explain it very well. Now, there is absolutely no proof, there is no evidence that our laws of nature are not dated, that they will break down, July, tomorrow is what, 14? So we don't know that tomorrow the sun will rise, but naturalism, all our explanations and all our experience tells us that the sun tomorrow will rise, and so we think until something really breaks down. So naturalism is in the same sense. Naturalism has worked, and therefore it is true on the basis of its own success. Now, there is no evidence, there is no reason for us scientists to think that there will be areas where it will break down, and then we will say, okay, methodological naturalism has to be given up. This is one, and I would like you to respond to that in a minute. The second issue is, to what extent can we subject belief or religions to reason? As I said earlier, I am very close to your own positions, but people believe in angels. Can that be justified on reason? People believe in miracles, really, breakdown of natural, of the laws of nature, etc. People will believe that I don't want to take some medicine because my religion tells me not to take that medicine, and I will pray, and cure will come through that. Can we subject it to reason and say that cannot be accepted? To what extent can we say religions, beliefs have to be subjected to reason or else? I think there's a gray area there.
Well, it depends how you define reason. I mean, if you define reason, of course, in a narrow scientific sense, then you're right that religious belief shouldn't be subject because you're begging the question against religion. But if you're saying that religious beliefs shouldn't be subjected to reason in a broad sense, which isn't ruling out the possibility of religion at the very start, I don't see why we can't talk rationally about even the existence of angels or other such things. I mean, what evidence is there? What historical evidence? What other kinds of evidence? What experiences justify it? Why would people want to talk about that kind of thing? It seems to me perfectly reasonable. And if people say they won't take certain medicine because their religion tells them not to, I'd want to know, well, why doesn't the religion? Well, what are the arguments? And I mean, what are they appealing to? Or appealing to something like natural law, where there might be some kind of argument, or is it just some kind of taboo which in fact is actually harmful? I mean, I do believe that some religion is harmful and therefore it ought to be exposed. I mean, at the extreme, some religions encourage human sacrifice. So that obviously, just because it's religious, is untenable. So I think that I'm not afraid of subjecting all religion to reason. Now, that doesn't mean that reason can close off certain subjects, that there may be some things that go beyond what in fact we have conclusive reasons for. And this is the trouble about the beyond the natural world. Going back to what you were talking about, naturalism, of course in science, methodological naturalism is in a sense part of its whole way of proceeding. It's a very important way. It couldn't proceed in any other way and be science. So science, in a sense, is the best advertisement for its own methodology. It has been successful. But that still doesn't answer the question whether methodological naturalism should be extended into something greater, which is what I called metaphysical naturalism. In other words, science can say, look, we're only looking for natural causes, let's see how far we get, and it's been quite successful in kind of filling in gaps. You might hear this week perhaps sometimes reference to the God of the gaps, and sometimes people have placed their hope on the fact that there have been gaps in human knowledge, and that's a terribly risky thing to do because those gaps can be filled. So it's not, and anyway, as people say, that God perhaps isn't just intervening in little bits of space here and there, he ought to be underpinning the whole thing. But nevertheless, it doesn't follow that from the fact that there is a gap, that it has to be filled. That's a metaphysical assumption. I mean, you see, I think there's a very important distinction between knowledge and reality, human knowledge and what there is, or in philosophical jargon, between epistemology and metaphysics or ontology. So what we know and what we might know is one thing, what there is another. And just because there are gaps in our knowledge doesn't mean there are gaps in reality, but it doesn't necessarily mean that because we're trying to close gaps in our knowledge that we will be able to. There could be ontological gaps. I mean, I think a good example of a possible area where there are ontological gaps is in quantum mechanics, where there is an indeterminacy. I mean, there's a big, again, philosophical argument, I suppose, about how to characterize all of that. But there do seem to be real ontological gaps there in a sense, which you could make something of or not. But certainly you can't just say, from a naturalist point of view, that there can't be gaps. Are there arguments between different scientists about chaos theory about whether it's ultimately determinist or not? But I mean, again, from a philosophical position, I wouldn't want to just say there couldn't be a gap, that somehow or other there has to be an ultimate determinism there. Determinism is a philosophical thesis which one would hold for philosophical reasons. I don't think a scientific thesis. And therefore looking for causes is good scientific practice, but saying there have to be causes is questionable philosophy.
That's a question at the back.
So beginning of your talk, you talked about how there's a great push to keep personal religious beliefs separate from public discourse.
Absolutely,
and
yes.
kind of push this out, that in fact some saying that there's just no place for someone in public office to espouse or even be motivated by religious belief. And I see that growing more and more in the U.S. one of the prominent military leaders had to basically apologize for saying that he had personal beliefs against homosexuality, and this was, and it wasn't his practice in his military, but it was just his personal belief. But even so, he was basically skewered for this, and things like that. We're hearing more and more people run for public office that if they hold strong religious beliefs, that they may be seen as unfit for being a public official. So my question is, what is the argument for people who do not hold personal religious beliefs, or their beliefs are more secular in that sense, personally? What would be the persuasive argument to them that it should not be, that religious belief should not be sequestered off into the personal realm, that it's good for society and rational for religious belief to be out in the public sphere and discussed as a motivational factor and all that, and that's a good thing? What would motivate someone who didn't have personal religious beliefs to agree with that? Do you understand my question?
Absolutely,
okay.
yes. I think it's a good question. I think in a democracy, when there's disagreement, I think all disagreement ought to be out in the open. I think it's very unhealthy to say that certain disagreements have to be sat on. In fact, you'll find in some societies, if religion is sat on, in some ways, it will break out in one way or another. I mean, you could argue that in some ways in the United States, the strength of the religious right, particularly I suppose of, say, some elements of the Republican Party, might have been partly because they weren't able to take what they regarded as a proper part in public debate, so they were having to put pressure on in other ways and fight politically in different ways, partly because of what the Supreme Court has done in recent years. They felt that certain things were being ruled out, and therefore, in a sense, because democracy wasn't being allowed its head, a pressure of steam was building up that would break out in some other way. So it's healthy for democracy, for disagreement which is there, to be out in the open. Why is religion important, and why should somebody who doesn't hold any religion feel that it has to be brought out in the open? One argument that I would produce, it relates to what I was saying about cognitive science of religion and children and so on. I do think that basic religious impulses are actually part of human nature. Now, I'm not going to build a lot on that, but just that religion is a universal phenomenon, and it's present in all societies, and it's very easy for everyone, even children, to hold quasi-religious beliefs. In other words, it's almost part of what it is to be human, to come up with something that looks a bit religious sometimes. And it's important that all of those things, again, be out in the open and be rationally examined. It's unhealthy if they're sat on, and indeed, I think if human nature is to flourish, it must be allowed to be expressed. Now, that doesn't mean that reason can't play its full part. As I was trying to say, these natural reactions come before rational reflection on them. But the rational reflection, not just on a personal level, but on a public level, is, I think, terribly important. And I think that actually what's happening is that I think sometimes, particularly in the United States, that some secularists know they're not going to win the argument democratically, so they're trying to win it by other means, through pressure through the courts and through other kinds of pressure. But I mean, that's beside the point, because even if one thinks that religious people are in the minority, nevertheless, I think in a democracy it has actually, for the sake of everybody, to be a matter of public rational debate. And, I mean, there is a role for respecting the beliefs of minorities, even if you don't. In a free society, sometimes the test of a free society is allowing beliefs you find repugnant, actually.
Yes.
I'm coming back, thank you, to your discussion about cognitive science of religion.
Yes.
Because I was linking to what I'd heard Robert Winston say last autumn, and you've just said in your answer that you thought maybe a religious sense was almost part of what it meant to be human, which I think is what he said. But I'm thinking of, not arguments, discussions had with atheist colleagues, and their response to that argument would be the same as my response to something you mentioned afterwards, where you were saying that small children think that inanimate objects have often a teleological principle. For example, that the stone wants to fall off the table. Usually it's my books want to fall off the table. And
Or my computer has a mind of its own. I mean,
oh, yes.
how easy it is to attribute that kind of information
Yes.
to the computer. And that's a very natural human reaction, even for grown-ups, actually.
And I think partly my job as a physics teacher is often to contradict that belief, that whether we want to think it's a gravitational field or the Earth's mass distorting space-time, but that's the reason that there's a force on the stone. And so the response of atheist colleagues would be, yes, that's something that maybe is built in, but it's something that's a mistake. And I wondered what your response was.
But in a sense, I was aligned for that kind of reaction, because I was saying whether there are these natural reactions, so you can't just ignore religion. Well, that's really what I was trying to say. It isn't something that to be just thought as a kind of idiosyncratic thing that a few odd people do. It's much more central than that. But rational reflection on it and on our religious impulses, which would come through science and through theology and philosophy, that is also important. And of course, science would have a lot to say about some of our impulses. But I think all I would say is that I don't think science is the only way of rationally reflecting on these things, but it must join forces with other things. But you see, that there has been a doctrine linked with science that, in fact, there has been a remorseless tendency to secularization in our society. Now, 40 years ago, I think particularly, there was a thesis that all Western societies were, in fact, progressing, and they did think of it progressing, to a totally secular way of thinking about things. And this was partly through the growth of science, that science gives us this vision. Science is winnowing out superstition, and religion was the archetypal form of superstition. And so there's this remorseless tendency, and the more we go on, the more science will grow and religion will wither away. Now, the interesting thing, and I suppose one reason why religion is being more widely discussed again, is that sociologists, and even those that were putting forward that thesis, now recognise, I think, that that is unsustainable, that there is not a remorseless growth of secularization. In fact, countries that are very secular are the exception rather than the rule. We may be living in one here. Western Europe may be a good example of countries that are very secular. But it isn't what's happening in most of the world, Africa, South America, even the United States, elsewhere. Indeed, the breakdown of communism, where look how quickly, for various reasons, religion is resurgent. In many countries, even where atheism, in countries like Albania, was absolutely dominant and remorseless, and in Russia, look how quickly the church has been resurgent. Now, I mean, all kinds of reasons for that, and it's all been harnessed politically, etc. But nevertheless, it's quite clear that it was not being stamped out. In fact, the religious impulses of people were there much more strongly. I was reading a book the other day which pointed out that it was quite clear that in a lot of the Eastern Bloc, people were keeping quiet about their religious beliefs because they didn't realise that other people held them too. Everybody assumed that nobody held them and nobody would dare say it. And then suddenly, in 1989, when the pressures went, suddenly everybody realised that other people thought as they did. And so that actually the state was sitting on something that was there. So I think that the secularization thesis is something that's very dubious, that human nature, as I've said, is much more resilient, and religion is part of human nature. But that doesn't mean we just have to accept human nature. As I've said, rational reflection, and I mean, I've been with the atheists here, that I'm not going to in any way want to stamp on rational reflection. All I'm wanting to say is to them, don't define reason in such a way you've solved the issue before we argue about it. And that's what some of them do.
Dennis, I think this will have to be the last question, but then we've got half an hour of informal chat.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up, it's just a comment really, but I want to pick up on Jennifer's question as well about the, how do you persuade people out in the public domain that actually religious arguments should be brought out in the open in the way you're suggesting. It seems to me, one of the curious things about scientists is that often they don't realize that they have metaphysical beliefs. They actually think that other people do, but they don't. It's a very curious thing. It's because they haven't done any philosophy, and this is a problem with the scientific community generally. But also you find that, I think, out in the public domain, that government officials also think, that secular people who don't believe in God don't have metaphysical beliefs and so on. So it seems to me it would be quite helpful to actually do a bit of training of people so that atheists and agnostics and everybody knows that they actually do have metaphysical systems of belief. And therefore, it's not a question of so much of religion as people understanding that they have sets of metaphysical beliefs that actually do influence their decision making in the public domain as well as the private domain. And all of those should be brought out in the open. And therefore, we should try and campaign against giving religion a special label as if that's the only category of beliefs that are metaphysical, whereas actually having metaphysical beliefs, I guess, is part of being human, isn't it? That's what being a human being involves. You can't actually be a human being without that. So I just wanted to put that into the equation there.
No, and I agree with that. That's one reason I called one of my books Philosophy Matters, and it wasn't Religion Matters. I was arguing for philosophy, and in a sense that's in tune with what you're saying. One of the problems about people who don't realise they have philosophical beliefs, in a sense, common sense is a kind of philosophy built up over many generations. But one of the problems of more sophisticated people is that they either don't realise they have philosophy, or if they do, what the philosophy they're operating with is very often that of a previous generation. In other words, it's 30 or 40 years back. There's always a time lag, I suppose it's much the same in the frontiers of science. There's quite a time lag between what's been held in a discipline and the way it filters through to everybody else. Postmodernism was a good kind of example that, it's still a phrase used, but it was something that grew up in the 1980s, or it's been going on for 30 years or so now. So it's the kind of thing that tends to pop up on Radio 4's Today programme, or soap operas even. It's begun to get into the public domain after a big time. I think logical positivism, as I said, very much something that was in the air when I was young, is still influencing people. People of my age, a bit younger, who would be in positions of responsibility, grew up in an area where, even if they weren't studying philosophy, those were the ideas that were taken for granted. I see that very explicitly in Richard Dawkins' work. That's the kind of thing he just has absorbed in a way. And I think that therefore one's got to be very careful. That's why I want, in fact, philosophical argument, rational reflection, because it's no good just taking for granted things which are very often the received opinion of a long time ago, which has been given up by people who've thought a lot about these things.
Well, I think that's a good moment to stop. Roger, you'll be here for the next half hour.
Of course.
Some of these other people would love to chat with you, so take that opportunity. Lunch will be about 1 o'clock in the dining hall, and we'll start again at 2. So let's thank Roger again.